move it. Okay, all right, well, thank you. You sit down. So can I say a few words? Thank you.
Absolutely.
Well, it's rare in life you get to go to your own funeral and actually see what people are going to say about you. So for those of you who outlive me, you don't need to go to my funeral. You just heard everything that's probably going to be said. But I want to thank everybody here for their kind words and their recognition of some things I've tried to do. I want to thank the LBJ Foundation, library, thank both of you for what your father did and what you've done for our country. Obviously, I want to thank Larry Temple and Lloyd Hand and Cappy McGarr for everything they've done to make this possible this evening. And I'd like to thank Nancy Pelosi for her kind, overly generous words. Thank all. I'd like to thank Cokie Roberts for her great job she's done serving as MC. And I'd like to thank Harolyn Blackwell for extraordinary voice and terrific performance. Where's Harolyn? I regret very much my mother couldn't be here. She would have believed everything said about me. She's probably the only person who would believe everything that was said. Most people here really know that's not all true. Let me just say one real serious thing, if I could. We stand here in front of the most important documents in our country's history: the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. Those are the originals. Those are the only copies. Those are the originals. And it's hard to believe that the person who wrote the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, an extraordinary man, Leslie Bowman, who runs Monticello, is here. He wrote that all men are created equal. Now, of course, he did that while he was a slave owner, and he had 2 slaves with him when he wrote that. But he did believe that all people were created equal, and ultimately all people should be treated equal. And that was the creed of our country. All people are created equal, and all people really should have equal opportunity. Tragically, we didn't really do that when the country began. When the Constitution was drafted, we had slavery put into the Constitution in effect. And so we had this birth defect in our country. And for 100 years, we lived with slavery, the inhumanity, the intolerance, the brutality, the awfulness of slavery that killed millions of people and disrupted the lives of millions of others. Abraham Lincoln tried to do something about that 100 years after our Constitution came into effect with the Emancipation Proclamation, the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and ultimately the 15th Amendment, all of which came into effect after he died, tragically. But for another 100 years, our country lived with the Jim Crow laws, and all men were not created equal, and all women were not created equal. Not until Lyndon Johnson became President of the United States did we finally address the birth defect that we really had in our Constitution and in our 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Lyndon Johnson became president after a tragedy. And what he did is something that changed the lives of all of us here and all of our children and grandchildren. Because what he did this at great political peril. He said, I'm going to change the way this country treats people who are not white. I'm going to have civil rights legislation. It was at great political risk. He had come from Texas. His friends in the Senate were not supporters of this. John Kennedy, his predecessor, wrote a book called Profiles in Courage about senators who had done courageous things. There was no book about presidents who had done courageous things, but had there been one, the first person written about would have been Lyndon Johnson, because a great political sacrifice to himself and to his party, he made it certain that the 1964 Civil Rights Act came into being. Now, many of us have grown up in a time when there was segregation. This was a segregated city. When I was growing up in Baltimore was largely segregated. The schools I went to were largely segregated. We tolerated this because we didn't know any better. We didn't think we could change it. Lyndon Johnson had a different view. He thought it was possible to go against many of his best friends and many of the people who were his constituents in Texas, and he made possible to pass that civil rights bill. He made it possible to get it out of the House Rules Committee through Judge Smith. He got Edward Dirksen to support it, and ultimately it became law. And he then signed that bill in 1964 with 75 pens, 75 separate pens. Some of them, no doubt, are owned by people in this room. But that wasn't all. In 1965, he recognized the Civil Rights Act wasn't enough. We needed a Voting Rights Act. And he made it possible for the Voting Rights Act to get through, so that ultimately people who were African American and other minorities could vote. And that wasn't all. He also pushed through the 1968 Fair Housing Act so that people could live where they wanted to live. Those three legacies, those three bills changed the way all of us live and our society lived. And finally, after those three bills, while we still have imperfections in our society and while we have much to do, those three bills were the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the 20th century, and they made it more possible than ever that all men would be created equal in our country. So I accept this award in the recognition that Lyndon Johnson did more than anybody in my lifetime to change the imperfections and birth defects that our country had at the beginning and made it a much better society than ever was. So thank you very much for what your father did. Thank you. Thank you.